Good evening to y'all. I'll tell you the kind of week that I've had, the lesson that I've mustered is to do with persistence. And there's a reason for that, because persistence has a lot of brothers and sisters, things like endurance and perseverance and diligence and things like that. But persistence is unique because it really means that you're keeping on even when it gets difficult, even when it's hard, right? And I thought, man, I've only been sick a few days of 1 week, and some people, have chronic illness. We know some of them, and they face it all the time. And bless them for their persistence, right? Because it's a lot to bear, and it's hard to watch the little ones too when they're having a hard time of it. And I know it's been through a lot of the households here, so you know well what I'm talking about. But pushing through even when it gets difficult. And I thought, well, I'll give you a few real-life examples before we look at the Bible ones. We mentioned sickness, but, in higher education, sometimes people change majors, and sometimes the reason for that is because the one they chose might be a little too difficult or just not quite their cup of tea, and they need to make a change. Sometimes people drop out altogether. You see it with marriage, don't we? See that a lot with marriage. When it gets a little too tough, the tough get going, but going away, more like it, right? And we see a lot of divorces because persistence is just not there. If you've ever tried raising children, try doing it without a little persistence, right? And consistency and a whole lot of other things there, right? So you can see it there as well. And, maybe depending on your work, or maybe everybody's work, but I've always been impressed with farmers. And I've driven a lot of the countryside in this state, from Winchester and Lynchburg up to Moss and Byrdstown. And I've seen a lot of farms, and I've seen them guys out there working. But you talk about persistence. They can't get started in the year if the weather doesn't let them get started. And they may get the crop in the ground, and the freeze come and kill it and have to start over again. And then it comes time to get the crop out of the ground, and sometimes the weather won't let them do that. And then they got to get it in the barn or get it sold or something, or they're going to lose it still. And so, there's a livelihood that's got persistence written on every single day. But you see, in any of these cases, sometimes you might think, boy, it'd be just a little easier just to give up, just to kind of let it all go away. Never mind all this persistence and stuff. But what about the spiritual sense? Jesus has told us, and it's great that he did, but he said, hey, my yoke is easy and my burden is light. And that's an encouragement in and of itself, because what he's saying is the things that I've got for you to carry, you can carry. And I would know because I made you, right? And the burden is the one that I gave you. So we should find comfort in that. But even still, within the church, being inside Christ, Galatians 6:2 also gives us the promise. It's a beautiful, concise statement, especially for Paul, right? But bear ye one another's burdens, and so fulfill the law of Christ, right? So even when that burden gets whatever the burden is, gets a little too heavy for us, we've got a neighbor we can link up with and help to bear that burden, right? So that should help us a lot with our spiritual persistence. But I want to take you back through the 3 texts that we read tonight just real quickly, okay? And the first one was Philippians 3. And I know this is a commonly sourced text because Paul says a whole lot here. But there in verse 11, I've always noticed how he says, that I might attain. This guy's the apostle of Christ. He did amazing things all over the place, and he's still saying that I might attain. He hadn't counted himself as had it in the bag, that he accomplished it already, right? But verse 12, he says, I've not already attained, but I follow after. So he's still going for it. But look what he says in 13. He says, forgetting what's behind and reaching for what's ahead. And I thought, he went through a lot of perils of the sea, perils of the false brethren, all kinds of perils. He had to persist through a whole lot of things. But look at his little secret recipe right here. Because sometimes the burden we carry today is heavy enough that we don't need to be carrying the one from 10 or 20 years ago. And he says, I forget what's behind. I can't do that. Man, I wish I could do that. But he says, I forget that so that I can reach for what's ahead. Because if you've got a hand back here too, it's going to make it really, really hard, especially when the going gets tough. So he says there in 14, so I press towards the mark of the high calling of God in Christ Jesus, right? And I selected Hebrews 12, verses 1 and 2 for the same reason, because there he says, that great cloud of witnesses, right? All those heroes of faith there in chapter 11. But what he says there is lay aside every weight. And a lot of you do physical training around here, and I know that. And little ankle weights are awesome. Even back in my martial arts days, I used to put those on there and practice with them. When we take them off, boy, it's easy to move. But you would never go to race day wearing the weights, right? Because they would be the thing that hindered you and slowed you down. So he says, I'm going to take those things off and the sin which besets me, right? So that I can run with patience the race that is set before me. So it's like, well, if the race is hard, look and see if you got some baggage, that needs to be set down. Let's see if you've got some sin that's ensnaring us, entangling us a little bit and tripping us up that needs to be taken care of in our life. And then maybe this persistence would become a little easier again. So what I'm trying to say is that Jesus gave us this light burden and this easy yoke. And if it ever feels difficult, maybe it's because it's the things that we're holding to back here or holding to in the now that are causing the conflict and the wrestling inside that have made it harder on us. Now, sometimes we can be third party to a lot of things bad that happen in life that's no fault of our own. And those are those burdens that we would definitely need one another, my voice, folks, we'll need one another for to help get through it. So, the third verse of the passage was in 2 Peter there, right? Chapter 1, verses 5 through 11. One of persistence's brothers is here. He talks about diligence in verse 5. It's going to take diligence to do this. It's going to take persistence to do it. You know why I know that? Because this list, adding to your faith, virtue, and to virtue, knowledge, and to knowledge, temperance, and all these things, you think Satan's going to sit by and just let you do that? Of course not. Of course not. So sometimes it's going to be hard. Sometimes it's going to be easy. Our natural talents are different, right? But sometimes it's going to be difficult. And so just keep that in mind. That, when you do see, I always wondered that about James, when you fall into diverse temptation, count it all joy. And why? Well, then because Satan's still working on you and he ain't got you yet, right? Isn't that true? So that should be kind of an encouragement, something to think about. I tend to get easily frustrated by everything and want to be left alone. And I thought, maybe there's an optimistic view to be had in there somewhere. Why we should count that joy? But all these things that we're supposed to add, this virtue, this knowledge, the temperance, the patience, the godliness, the brotherly kindness, the charity. Look what he says, though, in 8 and 9. If you have them, you're going to be fruitful. But if you don't have them, you're blind. It's a blindness, right? And then in verse 10, give diligence, there it is again, to make your calling and your election sure. That's a responsibility that we own. So you can rest assured that God and Jesus have done their part. But it rests upon me to give diligence to make my calling and my election sure. It's going to take some persistence. It's going to take some effort. And I need to be probably prepared from the outset and not think it's going to be an easy road because I'd set myself up for more discouragement. I even tried to tell that to little Kate most recently because I said, well, it's great. I said, but now Satan knows he's got to work really hard to get you back. So, it'll be easy for a while maybe, but he'll come back around and test you again before you know it. And in verse 11, for so an entrance will be ministered unto you. So that's where your entrance comes from. See, it's all associated with that. So just a little word of encouragement tonight. That's really all it is. That sometimes you think you look at somebody so you're not being persistent or something like that. They think it's a criticism. It's exactly the way I'd take it if my mom said it to me. But it's really the intent there is to encourage you. Because I think discouragement is common to humanity. I was just a little snippy yesterday with Lena just because I didn't feel good. And then I felt bad for having an attitude. And it wasn't her fault. I told her, I said, I just don't feel good, kind of crabby. So we can get discouraged pretty easily, right, and ready to give up. But I tell you what, and I think this is a little bit important, and I've got to put a thumb down on this one, okay? Remember how much you've invested. Again, never mind what God and Jesus have invested, but think about what you've got under your belt. And what you have endured and what you have given up and the progress that you have made. It's really what the book of Hebrews is about. if you think about it. Those Hebrews who have become Christian, has fallen back to the Judaism, and he's like, no, really, look at what you've done, look at what you've gained. What a pity to sacrifice all that. It's like, the same thing in a marriage. Marriages fail, and a lot of them maybe earlier. Like, it's rare if it happens in the 30th or 40th year, right? It does happen, but it's rarer. And that's what, the more you've got invested, really the more you have to lose, And so think about that too, because just as a little side note, when I was in high school, I was just getting resettled into classes. They were balancing the numbers, so I didn't even know this girl. She was sitting next to me, and I said, "What's wrong?" And she says, "I just think I want to kill myself." And I said, "Why?" And she said, "Well, my parents." And I said, "Well, how old are you?" She said, "I'm 16. I said, "Man, you only got 2 more years. The whole rest of your life is yours. Like, you're almost there." And sometimes it's just a matter of perspective. But my point was, see what you've got invested. You got 16 years in, but you've only got 2 to go, if it's really that bad. Endure, persevere, have persistence to these 2 difficult years, but then you can turn the page, right? So we should always kind of look at what we've got invested and what we've endured in the past, because today feels heavy sometimes. Well, that's one more we can add to the bank when we pass, right? We endured that one more day, so we want to keep on keeping on. Like I mentioned, Paul persisted through many perils and his thorn in the flesh, right? But remember, Jesus didn't take that from him, right? He said, "My strength is made perfect in weakness." So he persisted with that one only with the help of Christ, right? So tonight, see, if you're not in Christ, you don't have what Paul had. We don't have what a lot of us here have. We don't have the bearing the burdens of one another, Christ that we can cast upon. I mean, you don't have that. And so much help with life's issues are found in him. And so tonight I would encourage you to make that decision. But if you are in Christ, you can still get discouraged. The burdens can still be heavy. You can get troubled. But you still have the benefit to bring that to him tonight, and we can pray for you on your behalf while we stand, while we sing.